Hi, this is Steve Rosen, author of that unbelievable new book, TONECHASER, Understanding Edward, my 26-year journey with Edward Van Halen. And you're listening to Metal Mayhem, ROC, with the Burnomatic, Metal Walt, and Steve Rosen. Yeah.
Well, you know what? I don't even have to do an opening now because he did all the work for me. Steve Rosen, welcome to Metal Mayhem, my friend. Let me introduce you to my co-host, Metal Walt from New Jersey.
How you doing, guys? I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Nice to meet you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Metal Walt.
Okay, this book, it's 600 pages. It's thick, it's heavy. Some days I don't have to do curls at the gym because it's so big. And it's one of those books where I'm going to be rereading it for years to come.
Wow.
The penmanship is fantastic. The attention to detail, it's just it's fantastic. Again, can't stroke you enough, Steve. Congratulations on the book. Before we dive right into it, let's get a little glimpse into your career. Just give us a quick little bio. I have a little antidote for you, and then we'll dive into this book.
Quick dive. I actually started writing for my high school newspaper. I had the first music column at Culver City High School. I would go out to clubs, I'd review shows, and I got a taste for it. I love doing that. Got out of high school, went to UCLA for a year, ostensibly to study journalism and English. That was a nightmare. And if you've read the book, you know what kind of a nightmare that was. So I thought, all right, fuck it. I'm not college. That's it. You know, I'm going to go out there and I want to be a writer. I want to write for magazines. I want to meet bands. I want to meet guitar players. So I started writing, got some things printed in the LA Free Press, which is like an alternative paper from back in the day. And then you use that as a stepping stone. And, I got some little pieces in Cream and Circus. And then I got a couple small pieces in Rolling Stone. Became a regular contributor for Guitar World in '84. Was a regular contributor to Guitar Player beginning in '73. And, man, you just branch out and ultimately, I was writing for a lot of foreign magazines, Japanese magazines, European magazines. Along the way, I'd written some books previous to the Van Halen book. Wrote a book on Prince, Springsteen, though I never interviewed those guys. And I was always skeptical of writers who wrote books with subjects I never interviewed. That's just me. Wrote a book on Ozzy. Wrote a book on Bad Company and Free, wrote a book on Randy Rhoads. And in fact, the first book I ever wrote and the first biography on him was Jeff Beck, called The Beck Book, that came out in Japan in 1978. And we all know Jeff passed recently, which was horrific. So that's kind of a quick dive.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that the passing of Jeff Beck, because learned in the book that was your first feature article when you started with Guitar Player, and it was a cover shot. So condolences to the passing of someone that meant a lot to you in your history and the whole history of Guitar Player. Any quick comment on Jeff Beck?
Yeah, man, absolutely. I've loved Jeff Beck, since I was, I don't know, man, Heart Full of Soul and Over Under Sideways Down, and I was playing guitar, playing those songs in bands. There was just something special about him the first time I'd heard him. I mean, and it's funny because, look, Jeff has always had this career, and he's been appreciated by a lot of people. But what happens is, and I don't mean to sound mean with this, but after his passing, it's like everybody in the world is now a Jeff Beck fan. And I find that a little offensive. Look, these people probably liked Jeff Beck when he was here, but you never heard them talk about him. Anyway, it just, it bothers me some. Anyway, I've loved Jeff from the beginning. I thought he was the greatest who ever lived. Notwithstanding Edward, who I believe, and there's a differentiation here, I believe Edward was the most influential guitar player who ever lived. I think that Jeff Beck was the greatest guitar player who ever lived, which isn't to say that Jeff also wasn't incredibly influential, and Edward wasn't obviously also an amazing guitar player. But yes, man, that was my first story for Guitar Player. Became a cover and began what would be a 5-year run with Guitar Player. Those were fun days, man. Those were great days.
To be on the fly on the wall back in the 70s. I absolutely would love to be there. But yeah. Today, as we publish this, it is the birthday of Eddie Van Halen. He would have been 68 years old, January 26th, when this episode will be published. We're taping we're taping this a few days earlier, but in pre-production, I planned this, celebrating Eddie. And those kind words of Eddie dig deep, because I am not a guitar player, but I have read your work throughout the years, Steve, at Guitar Player and Guitar World. But Eddie, besides being an influential guitarist, you know, if you're a guitar player, it's what he did behind the scenes with his amps and his guitars. And that's just as important. And that's, to this day, that's what's living on with the EVH brand with Wolfgang and Matt Burke, his longtime assistant. So, but there's so much to dive into this. Let's start at the beginning, because my co-host Metal Walt, he's very good at what he does. And when I booked this, he's like, "Oh, Vern, you know, just the other day we were talking with Graham Bonnet. You know, we're friends with Graham, and you know, we've been on a roll." He's like, "I just he had to take a crash course in this book." So he did some he did some you know, quick crash coursing. Walt, any early comments on what you have heard about this book, and any questions for Steve?
Yeah, so Steve, again, congratulations on this magnificent publication. I will say, yes, when I received the PDF version of it, I'm flipping through it and I'm going, wow, okay, chapter 2, 3, 4, 45, 62. We're up to page 625. I said, man, Verno's got the hard copy. I got the virtual copy. But anyway, you know what? My first reaction was, this book is unique, right? But you know what? I'm sure there's hundreds and hundreds of books out there about Van Halen or Edward himself and articles written. But in your own words, like, what did you set out to make this book different than just another typical Van Halen history book or an Eddie Van Halen biography of sorts? What makes this one stand on its own?
Well, that's a great question. By default, because I don't know if I set out to consciously try and write a book that was different than, you know, Brad Zielinski's book and Chris Gill's book, which is fantastic. Paul Brannigan's book, which I thought was really good. Paul's also a superb writer. You know, Greg Renoff's book earlier. Just by default, well, I mean, the broad answer is, I had a relationship with Edward that nobody else ever had. And that's just the reality of it. So, you know, in and of its own, coming from that viewpoint, the book was going to be different. Look, I know those guys, you know, I know that Brad spent a fair amount of time with Ed, but it was not like Ed lived, you know, 10 minutes away and he was hanging out with them for the better part of you know, almost 3 decades. So that in itself was going to make the book different. I also, at a point in time, as you suggest, you know, I'm writing, I'm like 100,000 words in, I'm 150,000 words in. And typically that's about the length, 175,000 words of a typical biography. You know, they typically run. So I'm 175,000 words in, man, and I'm not even, you know, 10 years into the relationship. I'm thinking, oh my God, you know, the book's going to be, you know, 3,000 pages long. I'll have to do it in, you know, 4 separate volumes. So I thought, you know what? Fuck it. It's my book. I'm going to make it as long as I want to make it. And that was a major consideration. you talk about the detail. I did not know when I was writing this if people were going to react to the detail in that way. I thought, man, am I just getting crazy here and just, taking, 5 pages to describe, the way the cigarette smoke was curling around his head. But you know what? It just felt natural doing that. I also talk about the book as being a modern fable, and I wanted the book to read like fiction, as if I had made this story up. So it gave me a chance to flex my writing skills. I could be a creative writer. I could say whatever I wanted. I didn't have to follow a format. It wasn't a strict chronology. It wasn't a discussion about guitars and amps. So I think there were a lot of things that really made a difference. It wasn't going to be a photo-centric book. There's like 6 or 8 pages of photos. Nothing great, but they kind of reflect what the book was. It reflected, kind of my background. So I think there were a lot of pieces that made the book different. I don't think I had to try that hard to make this book different than the other books that were out there.
So Steve, just tell us though about the friendship. Like, when did it start? How did it start? And how did it evolve? Because in the title, it says, whatever it is, 26 years of a longstanding friendship. Like, how did you meet him? And then you're probably one of a kind that you've maintained a friendship and a communication with him over a long duration, which, you read of a lot of others that he was a very elusive kind of guy, right? So how did that go down?
I think about that a lot. And I think in the beginning of, I think it's chapter 1, I write about, well, what if I hadn't gone to the Whiskey A Go-Go that night in June 1977 to see Cheap Trick record a live record? I don't really believe in destiny or it's pre-planned, but it's like, for those pieces to come together like that, man, it just, I don't know. Maybe there was something that worked there. I don't know. So I'm there on a Friday night. I'm there with my brother. And Michelle Meyer, the girl who booked the Whiskey, was someone I had met. I was playing in a band. She would book my band around, and she was just this fantastic girl. Knew everything about every cool band that was playing around. And so she saw me there, and she said, there's somebody you have to meet. And to be honest, coming from Michelle, I thought it was probably somebody special, but I had met a lot of very cool guitar players by 77. I had interviewed, Richie Blackmore and John McLaughlin and John Entwistle and Wishbone Ash, who I loved. I mean, I had met a lot of guys. I'm not saying that I was jaded by 77, 4 years into a career, but it's like, God, if it's some local guy, and he might be a great guitar player, but it's like, I just kind of want to say so. But it was Michelle, and I trusted Michelle. So she brings my brother and I upstairs, and there's this guy standing there, and I'm trying to remember if I recognized him or I didn't. I'm pretty sure I recognized him, though, and this is key. I had never seen Van Halen play. I had never heard this Edward Van Halen play guitar. So I didn't know who he was. I just knew that, oh, well, this is a guy whose band just got signed to Warner Brothers Records, which I thought was fucking unbelievable. And he was a band that was playing around town. So I thought, he's got to be a good guitar player. So we just started a conversation. Michelle introduced us. We started talking. And as my brother described afterwards, man, it was just like talking to one of our buddies, man. There was this instant connection with this shared love of Clapton and Cream and Jeff Beck and Blackmore. We actually talked about Michael Monarch at the time, who's in Detective, one of those bands, first bands signed to Zeppelin's label Swan Song. And it's like everything he said, I felt and connected with. And I knew a lot about Eric Clapton. I knew a lot about Richie Blackmore because I loved those guys. I knew a lot about Cream. I knew more than most people. And I don't say that in any egotistical way. It's just that that's what I love. So I listened to all the music. I read about it, such as there was to read, obviously pre-computer. So we're looking about magazine articles. So, I mean, I knew a lot. And I could tell if somebody made a comment about Clapton or Cream, and it was some kind of a surface comment or an innocuous comment, it's like, this guy doesn't know shit about these bands. But Edward, his comments were so incisive, and he was talking about Eric's playing. I thought, oh my God, this guy really gets it, you know. So I mean, it was like I was enamored with the guy. So we meet, we get along. He gives me his phone number. I'm trying to remember my chronology. About a year later, I interview him for the first time. It's a phone interview. He's amazing. Now, this is really key. I don't think he remembers meeting me. I don't think Ed would remember from one moment to the next what we did. It was a strange thing. At first, I thought, well, how the fuck do you not remember meeting me? You know, not that he should have met me, but it's like, I mean, how many journalists did you meet at the whiskey, Ed? You know what I mean? But I came to understand that he just never remembered that stuff. Following year, 78, I met him again, Day of the Green, and that amazing photo on the back cover that Niels Lozauer took was taken there that day. And again, I don't think he remembered me. You know, you talk about the friendship, how to develop. I can't tell you like, oh, it was the third time we met and the, you know, second interview for Guitar World when it was like, it tipped the scales and we became friends. I think we became friends the moment I met him the first night at the whiskey. I believe that. And I think if Ed were here, I think if you had asked him if he could have remembered that, then he would have said the same thing. So it was just one of those things that happened. How and why do you become friends with somebody? I don't know, man. You know, a shared interest, a chemical thing. I don't know.
Excuse me, Steve, before we go and discuss 78, 79, you mentioned Greg Renoff. He had the book Van Halen Rising. Mm-hmm. And let's pick it up from 77. It's been well documented in that book. The Van Halen at the time, they were huge in the local scene. Yeah. You never heard of them or seen them even now. You're writing globally. Were you living in the South California area? How did you not hear, see the band?
Dude, I do not know. I was living up on Weepaw Way, Laurel Canyon. I was literally 10 minutes from the whiskey. I was at the whiskey 5 times a week, 4 times a week. I was at the Starwood when they were playing. Here is the thing. I had heard of Van Halen. Everybody in Hollywood, maybe everybody, you know, even regionally had heard of Van Halen. But all I knew of them was that it was this local band that had signed a big deal on Warner Brothers. I knew they'd played the circuit. You know, I knew they had played Gazzarri's and they'd moved up to the whiskey. And I thought, oh my God, these guys are playing the whiskey. Because me and my small way, you know, I had my band and I am in no way trying to compare myself with them. But, you know, I mean, I would have cut off an arm to have played the whiskey or even the Starwood. You know, I was playing like Madam Wong's East and West, which were primarily punk clubs at the time, pretty well known. But, you know, I'd play on a Sunday night and there'd be 8 people in the audience. You know, 7 of them were my buddies. So, you know, to meet a guy who was in a band that was playing the whiskey and the Starwood had a deal on Warner, that to me was like, oh my God, they must be good. But in answer to your question, somewhere, and I don't know where, I must have seen one of those early shows. I know it was not before I met him, however. And I've looked up, you know, God bless the internet. You know, you can look and you can see calendars of the whiskey. You know, even though there's no mention of that Cheap Trick date, which I looked over and over for, trying to figure out. I have to find out the date of when I first met Edward, and I finally found it by a reference in one of my own interviews. Anyway, I looked at Starwood and I'm trying to match up dates. When would I have gone? Blah, blah, blah. In the, I think it's that first phone interview, Edward talks about the bomb that he used to put his effects in. And my response is, and I'm thinking about it now, my brother brought this up. My response is, oh, that's what that is for. Now, I think about it. My response is, oh, that's what that's for, as if I had seen the bomb and I knew what it was. But on the other hand, I could have just been sort of responding to his question. Oh, that's what that was for. Like, oh, that's why you smoke, not knowing the reason. So, you know, I think I must have seen them play live at the Whiskey early on. Then I think, no, I never did. So I don't know, man. But I know I never saw him play before meeting him that first time.
Even like
that I'm positive of.
Like that Farewell Pasadena Civic Center show that they did before they went on tour. Any of that? Nothing? Nothing,
man. Certainly never those bigger shows.
Yeah.
Strange. I mean, I don't know how I could have missed them. Even the Starwood. I mean, I was there. I mean, I swear to you, I was there 4 nights a week. You know, seeing every local band and Y&T, you know, who opened that night for them when they were signed. I mean, I must have seen them a dozen times. Wolfgang, I think they were, wasn't that early Autograph, Steve Lynch. I mean, I was seeing all those bands there. Black Oak, my God, I've seen them so many times. They used to open for every local band. I don't know how I miss them. The only thing I could think of is that maybe a lot of times they were playing with punk bands. I was not a fan of punk. And it's like, oh, man, I'm not going to go out to see, well, even though I might want to see Van Halen, I'm not going to go, you know, if there's a punk band. And the other thing, and this is kind of stupid, but the truth is, I was on labels. I was on the list at that time for record companies. So I was getting like comps. I would get tabs. So it's like, you know, before Van Halen was signed, it was like, if I'm going to go see him, I would have to pay to go see them. And not trying to be a snob. It's like, oh, man, I'm not going to go. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So who knows why things happen. But that, you know, weird stuff. Yeah, man, I just, somehow I miss them.
It's funny, Steve. Many years later, I remember when I was cutting my teeth with Van Halen and a lot of the bands, you know, late 80s, mid to late 80s. I'm 52, so it took me a while to catch up. I was a big bootleg collector, right? And I know those Starwood tapes showed up a lot through the 80s and early 90s. A lot of the Van Halen demos, the Gene Simmons demos, and a lot of shows off of those soundboards from those Starwood shows would pop up where Van Halen was doing. I remember they did a totally killer version of Gene Genie, David Bowie's Gene Genie. So it's nice to know that those archives still exist from back in the day. But Steve, I want to move on with this because it's fascinating when you go through your book. You know, you had this communication with him from that point in time in 78 or so all the way to early 2000s.
Yeah.
And my first reaction was, man, how is Steve fact-checking himself? How does he remember all of this stuff? There's no way. Like, you know, is he have a photographic memory? And then John comes to say, well, no, Walt, like he archived these things. So tell us how you archive these conversations.
This is funny. Tell them about the equipment you used back in 79.
Exactly. Well, you know, oh God, you know, and I'm still that way, man. I'm a Luddite. Honestly, I was late in getting a computer. I was still using an electric typewriter. My brother said, "You're out of your mind. You're getting a computer," because he was in that world, you know, man. Let's start with the gear. And I wish I could remember where I got it. It was I don't even remember the make. It was like a GE or something cassette player. It was so old and so bad. The capstans would make these noises, and Edward comments on it. Actually, I think he comments on it twice And I'm so embarrassed because as I'm listening to the tapes and I'm writing the book, I'm going, oh my God, he must have heard those sounds every time we talked. He's never said anything. And what a, you know, I feel like a total amateur. So they go like, ah, ah. And sometimes they get higher pitched. And depending on if it was the beginning of the tape and how much tension was on the capstan, or the end of the tape, you know, they'd change in pitch, you know. And because the microphone, you know, was like kind of sometimes close to the tape recorder, the microphone was picking up all these sounds. So these tapes would have these sounds of the cassette player on them, and they would drown out, you know, whoever I was talking to. And trust me, it wasn't just Van Halen, you know, Pete Townsend and Peter Frampton and Stevie Wonder. And I mean, interviews that, you know, I cringe to this day. The lid, you know, it would open up, you know, and you'd slide the cassette in and close the lid, and then you'd hit play and record. The lid, the hinges had broken. So if I hit eject, the lid would pop off. I had to keep my fingers on the lid when it was playing for fear that at any moment it might just pop up with the tape in it and eat the tape. My fingers by the end of the thing, man, would be like numb from holding the thing down. The microphone was like a $2 microphone I bought at a garage sale. The equipment was horrific. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, you know, I'll probably be, you know, how long am I going to do this? You know, I thought, hey, man, if I could do this for a couple of years and interview bands, I'd be happy. So it was partly that, partly you never think about the other side of it. I was only recording so I could write the stories and listen back and transcribe the tapes. Who would ever think? I didn't, and I don't think anybody else ever did, would ever think, oh my God, years later, it's the audio that's going to have the value. You know, I know guys, I mean, big time journalists who recorded over the cassettes, never recorded. They took notes. So, well, trying to get back to your question. I always had an archivist mentality. I was always a documentarian of sorts. So from the very first interview I did, though I recorded over the first interview I did, which was Joe Cocker, but that's another story. I kept all my interviews. I had them on cassettes. I met a guy, Dave Jeffress, who he kind of really loved what I did, and he loved the interviews, and he was a big Jeff Beck fan, and he kind of just loved, you know, me being a music journalist. He took the interviews and made cassette copies for me. So I now had the originals and cassette copies. Then he took the originals and dumped them to DVDs. So, I'm sorry, CDs. So I now had a set of everything on CD, and I subsequently had everything dumped to hard drives. And a more precise answer, Walt, honestly, what bothers me is that my memories weren't more complete. Basically, I was going off of what was on the tapes. So I'd listen to that first interview, you know, the first phone interview. I thought, okay, that's 78. Then I'd listen to the next one, which would have been dated, Van Halen. And I thought I dated every cassette I ever did. Well, I didn't. Some I did, some I didn't. So I had like, I don't know, man, a dozen cassettes that weren't dated that said Edward Van Halen. So I literally pick a cassette, listen to it, and listen to it, and listen to it, and go, oh my God, he's talking about the third tour, you know, or a track off an album, or a guitar, and I go, oh my God, that's 83, and I you know, I kind of reverse engineer and know, okay, that's the tape from 83, so I could write that chapter 1983, and I tried to, you know, find the month, when to when, you know, what kind of space we're talking about, and really, man, I racked my brain as hard as I could. It took me weeks and weeks and weeks to figure out the date when we first met at the Whiskey. And I finally heard, oh, Ed, don't you remember, man, we met at the Whiskey when Cheap Trick was recording live? I got, oh my God, there it is. Then it took me a long time to find out Cheap Trick recording a live album. Well, it's not Budokan, obviously. And I go, oh my God, there it is. You know, they recorded for 3 nights. It was just racking my brain, man, listening over and over to a section, trying to make the chronology as perfect as I could.
How many hours of conversations do you think you could guess you have archived with Ed?
In the book, I show the list of interviews. I mean, maybe 30 or 40 or 50 hours. I mean, there was a lot. I wish there were more. You know, I wish I recorded every second I was with him. You can't do that, right? I mean, it becomes unbelievably intrusive. You can't do that. But there were conversations I missed when he would have called, and yeah, I didn't press record. You know, didn't have the tape player at the ready. But like you said, man, I was together enough to have collected them, to have had them, to have stored them so the cassettes were still playable, right? Yeah. We all know analog tape dissolves and corrodes and goes away. So, I thank goodness for all of that stuff. I was able to go back to those tapes. None of them broke. Some of the quality was horrible, and I couldn't make out sections, which made me crazy. But, 80% of it was there. So,
But just the fascinating part, Steve, that Eddie trusted you, right? I mean, okay, some of it was like actual interviews, some of it was just small talk, right? But that the bond that developed between the two of you, he wasn't sitting there thinking, oh my God, this guy's strange because he's hitting record on everything we're talking about. He felt that comfort with you. And that was really the importance of this whole book, is you developed a friendship, which led to many, many other things, which you'll eventually talk about.
That's absolutely true. And, it's funny in the book, and there's only been like 2 people who have kind of had problems with it. They go, well, why don't you print that when, that part where Eddie says, don't print this or don't use this. I could only write the book if it was going to be entirely honest. And I say that from the beginning, in portraying as closely and accurately as I could who Edward Van Halen was and who I was. There are moments that I paint a picture of myself. I could have lied. I could have said I never drank with Ed. I never did blow with Ed. I mean, I could have lied and said that. I couldn't do that. I wasn't going to write that kind of a book. I could have taken the real easy way out and not printed that little bit where Ed says, don't print this. So no one would have ever thought that is a forbidden interview. They just would have, they wouldn't have had those thoughts like, well, why would you print that if Ed said don't print that? So what they don't understand is the fact that I put in and included don't print this, and now all these years later included that. That's how honest I was trying to be. I wasn't trying to be sensational or hurt anybody or rewrite history in any way. I just wanted to present the book and Edward and myself as honestly as possible.
Steve, I have a point on something. Yeah. And I'm not going to go back to the guitar player, Guitar World era, but in '94, I believe it was Guitar Player released a special edition unreleased interviews. And right. Jay Obrecht, is that the pronunciation?
I think it's Jazz Obrecht.
Okay, well, he released an interview, and in that interview, Eddie referred to Steve Rosen as a friend. And I think that is the personification and the label of what we're getting here. You are a friend, and for him to even mention you and call you out to another publicist or another writer is amazing. Yeah. And for you to include stuff that he said, don't write this. He's your friend, and you're not going to paint a bad picture of your friend. You're not going to sugarcoat it, but a comment on how you felt or you being mentioned in that light. That's impressive.
It was honestly, and I don't want to get maudlin about it, man, but I read that. I mean, I cried. I thought, wow, that's unbelievable. And the thing that's strange is somebody sent me that clip because I had never seen it. I hadn't been for a guitar player for years. I didn't know about that issue, and I read that, and I thought, my God, he really thought that way about me. I mean, you thank your friends and you want to believe your friends and you do things that friends do, but to hear him say that, like you say, especially to another journalist, was unbelievable. And I have to give props to Jazz for printing that, because he didn't have to put that little bit in his story. And as an aside, Jazz just put up the audio of that interview on his site, Talking Guitars. And so I listened to that, and to hear Edward actually say that was pretty unbelievable. So, yeah, we were friends, and Edward trusted me. And because he trusted me, I mean, I would have never betrayed that trust in 1,000 years, So, yeah, and he knew that. The other thing you have to remember is that when he said that, don't print this, he may have been talking about Michael Anthony or Dave. And at the time, when he said it, 78 or 79 or 80, in the thick of Van Halen and the third or the fourth record, he didn't want me, he didn't want anybody knowing what he was saying about Dave or Mike. He loved those guys, and I think we all get that sense. But he was frustrated, So that's another thing that comes out. People get, they said don't print this. I said, yeah, but he said that in 1979. We're now in 2021, and a lot of that is common knowledge. A lot of it's not, but and a lot of it is personal stuff that has. I've sat on for 17 years, but so you have to understand that a lot of that was talked about in the moment, and that had that stuff come out about Mike or Dave back then, that could have been pretty disastrous, I think.
Any nuggets you could share that you've been sitting on? Because I have some questions.
Yeah, man. Honestly, I think I pretty much laid it all out there. I mean, honestly, there were bits that I thought, my God, do I really want to include this stuff? Because I thought maybe that was a bridge too far, but it's all out there. I don't think that there's one. Honestly, I don't think there's one little bit that I left on the tape that's not on the page. Yeah.
Hey, Steve, I have a couple questions. I mean, maybe getting off track on the book a little. We'll come back. Sure. But, there was several eras of Van Halen in totality, right? You had the rise. They hit their pinnacle in 1984. I am a 14-year-old kid. I couldn't believe it when David Lee Roth leaves. Reboot number 2, Sammy comes in. The band is reborn again, hits a second career. Gary Sharon comes in, Sammy comes back in, then leads to the reunion. What were those conversations like with you and Ed at all of those, let's say, turning points of the band? Like, what was talked about when it was like, okay, we got 5 #1 singles on 1984. We're on top of the world. But, and then there's a but that comes in there. What's the but?
That's a good question. We never got specific in that way. Ed, I mean, I can remember, and I talk about him in the book. As an aside, just real quickly, I can tell you that Edward was happiest in the very beginning of the band. I actually think he was happy in the club days. Obviously, he wanted to make it, every guitar player wanted to branch out. But I think those first couple records, maybe the first 3 records, I think were the best times for him. At least to me, that's when he seemed most content, happiest. 1984, he was very proud of that record. I think Dave leaving, and we talked about that, was, I think that hurt him immensely. he couldn't understand it. I think he felt disrespected. The early days of Sammy, I think he was so happy to have found Sammy. Again, these aren't, it's not like I ever asked him, well, Ed, what's, is it going to be different now with Sammy, or are you happy days? I never had those kinds of conversations. I guess I wish I did. So it was more kind of generalities, us talking about things. And he talks about, not particularly being a fan of Sammy's writing, Sammy's solo writing. But he was really happy when Sammy came into the band. By the time that Gary Cherone came in, we had grown actually a little distant by that point. I think he was really anticipating big things with Gary. But yeah, I don't think we ever had any kind of incisive conversations about that. Yeah. So
it's excuse me. Well, going to the Fair Warning era, and well, in the back of the book, you have pages, an interview with Michael Anthony, his comments, and David Lee Roth and Jimmy Page. But in the section where Michael Anthony was talking about when Dave finally left the band, he was saying that it couldn't have come a day sooner. It was time, and it was the breaking point. And this is all well documented in Noel Monk's books, and it's been documented. Noel Monk, not to off topic, but that book, it's like this book fits nicely with The Rising in the Noel Monk book as the pinnacle, the Van Halen book. But comment on that. What did Mike mean by that? That it was just so toxic that Ed was ready to, get on drugs, or not that he explain on that.
Yeah. Well, one thing you have to understand is that Michael Anthony said those things to me contemporaneous at the moment, right? It comes out later in Noel's book or Greg's book, and taking nothing away from them. It's common history now. It wasn't when Mike was telling me that stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Mike, and I don't want to put words in Mike's mouth, Mike really, really disliked Dave. And I think that he saw what it was doing to Edward. I saw what it was doing to Ed, I didn't know Dave that well. Like I said, I'd only interviewed Dave one time. I ran into him probably a couple times. He was always cordial to me. I just don't think I don't think he gave Edward the respect that Edward deserved, or just a simple acknowledgement that how hard Edward worked for the band. So I think Mike saw all of that too, and Mike was just a lot, I don't know, maybe more vocal than Edward. I mean, Mike just really, he hated that ego that Dave had, and saw what it was doing to Edward. And I saw it too. Man, Ed, he's just so unhappy. I mean, my God, you make an album like 1984, and that's other stuff you're dealing with. I don't know.
Well, that whole thing with Fair Warning, and you wrote in the book that Eddie wrote everything. Those guys did not bring anything to the table. They come off tour from the Women and Children First, and everyone turns around in 1980 and they turn around and look at Eddie and say, "Hey, Eddie, what do you got?" Like it's an endless well. And Ed, you wrote in the book that Eddie stated that he lost weight. He wrote that album in 2 weeks. It's their darkest album. One of the first albums where two things, there were no cover songs, and they really weren't dipping into the old music well. The ideas from, stuff that they cultivated from the old cover or old demos and all that.
Yeah.
So, you know, that fair warning, and this is my take, that when Diver Down came on, and, you know, Ted Templeman was always the referee in that relationship. And it's just fair warning, and then Diver Down, and then the hit single. That was the downfall in my eyes. Tell us about the fair warning era and some of those tidbits.
Edward loved that stuff, man. And yeah, he talked about, yeah, it was making him sick. But I think it was maybe the first time since those early records that he had a chance to push himself, right? All those multiple guitar parts and the layers. I think he wanted to say something to Ted, like, Ted, look what I can do. You know, the relationship between Ted and Ed, where it was strange. I mean, you know, you read the book, Ed just, you know, kind of being really unhappy with Ted, but always bringing him back, which I could never understand. Obviously, Ted was integral for that, you know, for that band. Much more so for Dave, right? He was always Dave's guy. But it's one of the few times when Ed would talk about his playing and go, yeah, man, I was happy with that. I thought his playing was just unbelievable. I mean, just incredible. And maybe just left to his own devices, that's what it was. I don't think he was thinking about anything else. Like you say, you know, cover singles, and he was just going to do what he was going to do. It's funny because I don't think he thought of it as a dark album, but I think I characterized the one single and the one solo, and I forget which song it was. I go, man, well, you were an angry young man. You did that solo, and he kind of laughed because he didn't think of the record as being angry, you know. But I think everybody who listens to it gets that sense that, you know, that's angry, you know, maybe passionate is a better word. But yeah, it was amazing. Yeah, he had to go from that to Diver Down. You know, and there were some good songs on Diver Down. But, you know, Ed was the first one to tell you about, you know, all the covers. You know, I don't know, there were 4 covers, or he said, there were 4 covers too many, or something like that, you know. But yeah, the beginning of the downfall, they certainly changed on Diver Down, that's for sure.
Well, the studio dynamic, you know, they had that great idea of releasing Pretty Woman as a carryover, because the band was going to take a little break, and then it gained momentum, and this was the beginning of MTV. They did a video, and that was the seed that started with Lee Roth and the visual that eventually led to that, you know, Dave going solo. But, you know, Eddie wasn't about that. This is, you know, he just was a musician. He didn't even call himself a rock star. You know, do we call him a recluse? Or is he just a simple man that liked to play guitar and keep to his own?
With that, it was music first, music second, and music third. And hats off to Dave. That's what Dave brought, right? Even though Edward says that Al had a lot of the, you know, brought ideas to the videos, but that was Dave's oeuvre, right? The onstage thing, the videos, the bigger than life, because Edward was not that person. Was Ed a recluse? Yeah, but he was always reclusive, you know, playing music. It's not like he didn't go out a lot. I think at a point in time he couldn't, you know, people mobbed him. He didn't like that part of it. With Edward, he was one of those guys, yeah, it was always about the guitar. It was always about music. And that, you know, that could cause problems. One, your other band members, you know, is anybody going to work as hard as you? When I say you, I mean Edward. I mean, I don't know if anybody worked as hard. You know, I don't know if Al worked as hard as Edward. You know, I mean, he was out there writing and you know, getting the studio together. And when he talks about 5150 as being a tool for the band, he absolutely meant that. And that they didn't get it at all. They were threatened by it. Dave was threatened. Ted was threatened. I mean, I'll tell you, man, if I was in the band and my guitar player, you know, thought enough to pay for his own studio, I think I I don't know. I think that's the greatest thing in the world. My God, he loves his band so much and wants to put it in the studio. Anyway, yeah, I mean, you know, marriages, you know, Edward, you know, loved Valerie and, you know, everything else, man. But it was music, you know, first and foremost for him. And you have to be a certain type of person. You have to be a certain kind of, you know, person in a relationship with Edward to understand that. And you can up to a point, and then it gets really difficult. You know, I call it the care and feeding of a guitar god, and it's not an easy thing to do. You know, in my once removed way as a friend, you know, I saw that so many times. And it's hard. It was hard, man. It's like, you know, you're always going to be second to the music. And, you know, when they wants to work on the music, you go home. And so, yeah.
Do you think he's passed some of that work ethic down to his son? He's building his career?
I think in a big way. I've never met Wolf. I've never spoken to him. You know, in the book, Edward talks about him, which is probably the first time he's ever spoken to anybody outside of his family, and, you know, about his son being a musician, and, you know, he plays me those drum tracks. Yeah, I think Wolf got that big time. Obviously, he got the musicality. Very talented kid. I mean, you know, yeah.
I remember, I think it was when they did that short-lived, well, call it reunion tour. I think it was 2005 when Sam came back in and they put like a greatest hits with 3 new songs or something. And I remember seeing that show in New Jersey at the Meadowlands Arena. And I guess Wolf had to be about 12. And during Ed's solo, and Ed wasn't in a good place at this time. I remember there were questions of, you know, his sobriety. He was in a weird space. But I remember at the time not even knowing who Wolf was. And he came out on stage and soloed with his dad at 12. And that should just tell you about the work ethic of him and his son, that here's a kid that should be in school and he's traveling the road across the states in the middle of the summer or wherever it was, you know, so that should tell you something.
Absolutely. And again, I think when Ed, you know, played with that little, you know, Wolf channeling John Bonham, I think he was 11. And I heard this, you know, somebody playing these drums on the tape, you know, the tape I'm listening to, Edward recording. I thought, my God, that kid is 11 years old. It's pretty amazing. And the other interesting thing is, I did ask Edward way before he had Wolf, you know, would you want your child, you know, to be in music? And that says, well, you know, if that's what he wants to do. I mean, look, growing up in, you know, as a son of Edward Van Halen, I mean, was Wolf going to be anything else? Yeah. I mean, sure, he could have been an engineer or a pilot, but I mean, you know, come on. I mean, the chances of him being a musician were probably pretty high, right? Yeah. You know, yeah. Very talented kid.
Steve, now, listeners, this conversation, first and foremost, it exemplifies that there's just so much in this book, and a lot of these stories is colored, again, by Steve's penmanship, if you will. It's just, it goes on and on and on. But in the back, you have some testimonials from some famous rock stars, and Jimmy Page had some comments. And I got out of this, were these backhanded compliments to Ed? And Eddie mentioned that him and Alex back in like 73 or 74 would go to the Forum and see Zeppelin, and he'd watch Jimmy Page like do pull-offs and hammer-ons. And then in these comments, Jimmy Page was like, well, I don't play that way, whatever they're called. And I don't know, what's your take on these Page comments? Because, you know, and then another comment he had, like these English guys, Eddie was the new guy. And what's your comment on Jimmy Page's comments?
Well, I can tell you exactly what it is, because I remember that very clearly. So I was in Daytona Beach interviewing Page for Guitar World. And again, I notate in the book I did not interview Jimmy specifically for the book. Those other interviews that you read in there, for the most part, maybe Ozzy wasn't. I interviewed all those people specifically for the book that I was working on at the time, which was Edward's authorized biography, which, as we all know, sadly never happened. So I was interviewing all those people specifically for the book. With Page, the interview had gone so badly, and it was like he would yell at me. I'd ask him an innocuous question, and he'd go, "What the fuck you want to know that for?" And the question was like, the first question of the interview, and then I'll get to your point, John. I asked him, "Oh, so it must be, this is during the Firm, it must be, way different working with Paul Rogers as opposed to Robert Plant." He goes, "Well, yeah, well, what the fuck do you think? Of course it's going to be different. What do you think?" And this is the first question out of my mouth. And I thought, it was an interesting question. I thought he was going to get into, writing with them and their lyrics and the personality. But no, it's like in his mind, I don't know what it was, man. He was insulted, or it went downhill from there. I had a screaming migraine headache. I almost threw up on his fucking shoes because I was so tense in there. So at a point in time, I said, "Fuck you." I started asking him questions about Eddie Van Halen. I was almost like prodding him with a stick. "Come on, shit brain."
Yeah.
That's when he said, "Well, yeah, and I know you're friends with Eddie, and I said, "Yeah, that's when he makes that backhand compliment. Yeah, I can't smile like Edward, and I can't play that stuff. But yeah, you're right. Ed ostensibly had seen Page do, the single kind of tapping on the Heartbreaker solo, right?
Yeah.
Which at the time was amazing. I mean, don't get me wrong. Page is amazing. I love Zeppelin, but the guy was impossible to talk to. So yes, those comments were backhanded. I don't think he thought much of Edward's playing. I truly don't. And the thing that's weird, and I've never heard anybody else bring this up, it may have been a Guitar World issue where there's a cover with Ed and Jimmy Page. And all of a sudden they're best friends, and Edward's passing. I mean, I'm sure that Jimmy had some words, and I'm sure that Jimmy was hurt when Edward passed. And, I'm sure it was a part of him that recognized who he was. But I think, in the scope of things, I don't think Ed meant that much to him. So yes, I believe every word out of Page's mouth was a backhanded compliment. I think he was just getting mad at me for bringing his name up over and over.
Was this before or after you spent 11 days on the road with him?
Oh, this is way after. This is 86. That was 77. And that's the other thing. It's like I walk in, I think, well, look, Page has done interviews with hundreds of journalists, but only one wrote a cover story in Guitar Player magazine in 77. And I think I'd said something, "Hey, Jimmy, we met in 77. Nothing. I thought, uh-oh, that's not a good sign, So, yeah, he didn't remember that at all.
You're on the road with Zeppelin for 11 days in 77? Man, that's...
That cover story in Guitar Player, that was pretty fantastic.
They were crazy then. What was that? Fish Story era and all that shit? Or you see anything crazy?
Yep.
Jesus.
Steve, it brings you back to your point at the top of the show about all these, fake people that claim to know Jeff Beck.
Exactly.
Like, I know it was Jimmy Page's birthday a week or two ago, and you saw all these people wishing him a happy birthday. I'm guessing you didn't send him a card at this point.
I didn't know, and had I known, no, I wouldn't have sent him a card. At a point in time, I was thinking, hey, you know what? What if I could somehow reach out to Page and have him write like a little blurb on the back cover? Yeah, Steve Rosen, that fuckhead, he asked me about Eddie Van Halen too much, Well, yeah, look. I just need to say, I love Zeppelin. I thought the first Zeppelin record was life changing. I'd never heard anything like that. I think Jimmy Page is amazing. But that being said, he's not an easy person to interview, right? So I want that on the record, guys. Okay.
Hey, they all can't be Richie Blackmore, right?
Yeah.
So Steve, I'm a big Deep Purple guy. I follow him even. I follow their present band with Steve Morse and now new guitar player Simon McBride coming on board. But there's something in the book where you talk about this 1979 show, a Rainbow concert at the Long Beach Arena, and you secured tickets and passes to get Eddie to meet Richie. And I think the history goes that maybe Richie kind of slagged him off or whatever. Tell us a good story about that one.
So let me back up just a little bit. What I knew that Edward was a big Blackmore fan. When I heard the first time I heard the first Van Halen record, and I write about it infamously in the book, not being blown away by it, my first reaction was, yeah, man, that's that Edward Van Halen guy I met, man. He's a good guitar player. This sounds like Deep Purple sped up. I just got a sense of Deep Purple, those fast boogies, Ed kind of the vibrato thing. That was my first instinct. So I always had a sense that Ed was a Blackmore fan. We talked about him that night when we first met. What I did not know is that Edward had met Richie at the Whiskey. And I forget, this is going back way early. This would be like before I met Edward, 73, 74 maybe. Richie was hanging out at the Rainbow where he hung out a lot. Edward was there. He saw Blackmore, walks over to Richie, who was there with John Bonham, and they both treated Ed like shit. I didn't know that. Edward never told that to me. So come 78, I had interviewed Richie the year before for the cover of Guitar Player. So I thought, my God, how amazing would it be if I could be the one to introduce Richie Blackmore to Edward. I thought, it's historic, man. I'll be the guy who brought these two guys together. So I got tickets. I got passes. I said, Ed, Van Halen. Ed, the Rainbow is playing Long Beach Arena. Man, you want to go? He goes, yeah, man. Great. I said, I got passes, And I don't remember if I said, man, I can introduce it. I don't think I did. I think it was just, we'll go to the show. So we go, and that was a night when Richie was in a mood, and he went on second, and Randy Hansen, who did like this Hendrix thing, did it very well, headlined. And I thought, my God, that is weird. I've never seen a headliner go on second and have an opening act or the middle act go on last. So we see the show, and I don't think either of us was particularly blown away, to be honest. It's a little hard to remember. But afterwards, it was like an after-show party at the Queen Mary, which is just a short drive away in Long Beach Harbor there. So we go, and I'm looking around, and I'm thinking, if Richie Blackmore went on second, something must have happened. I thought Richie could be in one of his moods, because I'd experienced a Richie Blackmore mood. I thought, oh my God, I'm about to introduce these guys, but the die was cast. So we're in there, and I'm looking around for Richie, and I don't see him, and I'm thinking, okay, Ed doesn't know that I want to introduce him. Ed's just here. We're going to have a drink and leave. And then I look over, and I see Richie, and I think Edward kind of saw him at the same time, and so I kind of walk over, and I see Richie looking at me, and I think he kind of, remembers me, because it was a Guitar Player cover. You have to remember, Guitar Player back in the 70s was the Bible. If you were a guitar player, you wanted to be in Guitar Player magazine, and to be on a cover was like, being kissed by God. I mean, that was special. So I think Richie remembered that. So we walk over, and, again, I try to remember, I think Richie may have shook my hand, and Ed's kind of standing there. And before I have a chance to Richie Blackmore, Edward Van Halen, Richie Blackmore, Richie kind of, gives him that snide look that Richie gives, and looks at him and goes, hey, I know you. you play guitar, right? You're a guitar player. And like, I'm gasping for breath. I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I do? What have I done, man? I've embarrassed Edward horribly. I've embarrassed myself. I go, Ed is going to be furious. He's going to scream at me. And rightly so, man. It was like me meeting Richie the first time, meeting my hero, and having him treat me like fucking horseshit. It was like, oh, it's just, but this is even worse because Edward, this is 78. It's not like Ed is an unknown entity, right? It's like, you know, it's the second record. It's like, or the first record, sorry. You know, they've been on tour. Richie knows full well who he is. Obviously, he knows who he is, but I also know who he is as a player, as a technician, as a guy who plays a Strat, as a guy who uses a whammy bar. So it was all those things. So it's like I felt horrible. Like I say, I don't think Edward brought it up on the way home. I know Ed was hurt by it, but Ed just, I don't know if he showed those kinds of things. Much later in a conversation with Jazz, Ed brings it up. In fact, not that much later. Sorry, in that same conversation, Ed brings up about meeting. Yeah, I met Richie, and he kind of dissed me this and that. Not that he would, but Edward didn't remember me introducing him to Blackmore. He doesn't mention my name in that story, though he does, you know, cite me as a friend. But you would think that he would have remembered that moment anyway. But he does remember, you know, being insulted by Richie, though he doesn't say, "Oh yeah, I was hurt or embarrassed." Edward was really sure of himself. Edward had this confidence. It wasn't ego and it wasn't being cocky, but he knew how good he was. And even if he was to be insulted by someone like Blackmore, it wasn't going to affect him like it would have affected some normal, you know, guitar player. Anyway, that's my feeling.
So Richie was cold, if you will. Jimmy Page had his problems. There's some talk of late about the relationship between Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. You ever share any thoughts on Randy? Because recently Rudy Sarzo came out and said, oh, Eddie had a problem with Randy. Ozzy mumbled something. Or is this stuff that's just blown out of proportion with media and stuff?
You know, honestly, John, I wish I had enough insight to speak, you know, truly insightfully about that. The only time I ever brought up Randy was just in that one conversation. I think you were maybe talking about local guitar players. You know, I said, what about Randy Rhoads? And it was, yeah, he's a good guitar player. You know, he's cool because he admits to being influenced by me, and no other guitar players say that. I wish I had pursued it more. Yeah, you know, it's one of those questions I wish I had gone after more. I've heard from people that there was some animosity there. A good friend of mine who knew Randy pretty well, had taken lessons from Randy, said that, yeah, there was some real animosity between the two of them. And I don't know where it came from. I never saw Edward being insecure in that way ever around any other guitar player. He may have been insecure in, you know, maybe his own music or, you know, maybe the band or the, you know, the interrelationship with the guys in the band. But I never heard him say, oh my God, you know, Bob Smith is so amazing. I wish I could play like that. He never spoke like that. So was there real animosity there, or was it just simple jealousy between two gunslingers? I thought what Ozzy said was really interesting in the quote. And again, this was not, I didn't interview Ozzy for the book. This was, I forget when I did that interview with Ozzy. I can't remember. But Ozzy said, well, if Edward had been in Ozzy and, you know, Randy had played with the Van Halen guys, maybe we all be talking about Randy. I mean, it was an interesting sort of analogy that he made. Yeah, I mean, I never heard Ozzy say one mean word about Edward. I mean, for all I know. But
hey, Steve, Steve, on jumping onto that topic, it's a perfect segue for me because I was always curious. There was a couple points in the career of Eddie Van Halen where, he did collaborate with others, and I'm a big Black Sabbath fan. I know he did play on the 1994 Black Sabbath album Cross Purposes on the song Evil Eye. And we talked to singer Tony Martin from that era earlier in 2022, and he mentioned that there was quite a writing session that happened around that time, 93, 94, with Eddie and Tony. And I'm just curious, from your history, because there was also the rivalry on the Never Say Die tour in 78, where Van Halen blew Sabbath off the stage. But I gather from, different articles and interviews I've read that Eddie and Tony unlike Blackmore, they were collaborators, friends. And throw Brian May into that mix. I know Eddie did some stuff with Brian May. So talk about some of the positive collaborations.
To be honest, I wasn't that aware of the Sabbath collaboration.
Okay.
I'm trying to think if Tony's name ever came up. I remember once referencing one of the Van Halen songs, and I said it sounded like some riff from Sabbath, War Pigs. Anyway, that was the wrong thing to say. Yeah, that was put a foot in my mouth. But no, he loved Tony, and I think, look, I don't know why. I've met Tony many, many times. He is the sweetest guy. All those guys, all the guys in Sabbath, Ozzy, whatever, however he's portrayed, he's nothing like that. He's a freaking funny guy, very sweet guy. Tony's an amazingly nice guy, quiet. And Ozzy's talked about, that they did get blown off by Van Halen. Ozzy admits to that. But I know that Edward did love Tony a lot. The Brian May thing, same thing. I think Brian, and I saw it when I write a little bit about the NAMM show in New Orleans when they jammed. And then later they kind of hung out. They were just like jamming in the room. I mean, I watched Brian May. It was like you or me. Well, it was like me watching Edward, play guitar in my living room. Just, you can't believe this guy's playing like that. Brian would watch Edward in that same way. And, there's a comment where Edward says, yeah, we might do another record and I'll play keyboards. And Brian says, oh yeah, like sure, like I'll play guitar in front of you. I mean, it was just that kind of, absolute awe of one another, because I think Ed really, really loved Brian's playing. So yeah, that was a collaboration. I mean, the Starfleet album, Starfleet project. I mean, it wasn't like the most brilliant thing in the world. They hadn't rehearsed. It was kind of a jam. But I mean, for what it was good. I mean, Edward actually played on a fair number of records.
Nicolette Larson
obviously the Michael Jackson record, which is not really a collaboration, more a coming in to do a guest solo. He actually did a solo on a Tim Bogart record. He loved Tim's bass playing. Tim was his favorite bass player. One of Tim's solo records. And there were some others. He wasn't a big collaborator. I mean, he just didn't do that kind of thing, And, we all know that he talked about doing that record, bringing in different people, Phil Collins and Pete Townsend. And I think him working with Pete Townsend could have been amazing because of Pete's writing and what they do. And I always heard kind of a Townsend-esque thing in Edwards, kind of that rhythm stuff he did. But so that never got past the talk stage. But I think with Ed, it was just always about his own music.
Sure. Appreciate that, Steve. Steve, I want to thank you for the time today. And before Verno closes this, I just wanted to ask you one more thing. Your conversations with Eddie sort of started fading out in the early 2000s or so. Was it something specific that happened, or how long did your friendship go, and why sort of did it just end? And had you been talking to him towards his private years and eventually his passing?
I don't want to give specifically the book away, but, and I try to answer it in the book, he started changing mid-90s, I think. And I don't know. I try to figure out what it was, you know, maybe the marriage. And I don't know that for a fact. He never talked about that, because by the mid-90s, we didn't have those kinds of conversations. What I characterize as our twilight tape conversations, you know, those very intimate talks and dialogue. I don't know. I mean, maybe I should have pushed him harder, or maybe I should have not let it go. But it's like, I don't know. But something was changing. Yeah, by 2000, that's when I went out and I did that DVD, the early years. You know, and he was really unhappy with that, as we all know. I don't know what happened. I mean, I give as close an explanation as I can come up with. We know after 2003 is when he went through horrible, horrible times, and we've seen those pictures of him and the hair and the samurai knot and the clothes, and you know, part of me is happy I wasn't around then. Maybe that's a chicken shit way to be. I mean, because I hadn't seen him for years. So I didn't know. I didn't know what he looked like. I didn't know how he was dressing. Every time I ever saw him, my God, the guy looked amazing. But I also think, and I don't know this at all. Maybe, you know, he was diagnosed with cancer in 2000. Maybe I don't know this at all. I'm only surmising, but maybe he was not. Maybe there was some mild. He wasn't feeling well going back to the 90s, and I don't know that at all. I don't want to put that out there as a rumor. I'm just trying to figure out and understand what happened. Right? There was no record label, I think, by then, or they were being dropped. I think the marriage was not working too well. You know, maybe the drugs thing was happening.
It was a bad time. It was people change, people grow up. I think you answered it well, Steve. I think you answered it well.
You know, I'm this person that takes everything to heart. Everything that happens is my fault. What did I do? Oh my God, that girlfriend doesn't like me anymore, even though she was cheating on me 15 days after we first met. Oh, it's my fault. I didn't have enough money. I wasn't cool. You know, man, trust me, I have enough guilt for the whole world. So I thought, what did I do, man? What could I have done to this guy for him to have done that, you know? And look, I may have done something that I can never remember where he wouldn't want to be friends anymore, but the way that it ended and the things he said to me, there's no way. Because trust me, those things I would remember. I thought, my God, if I hurt him that badly, for him to, you know, treat me like that, I would have remembered that. I didn't deserve that. So whatever he's going through, that's on him, you know. Had he not wanted to be friends, he said, hey, man, I don't want to be friends anymore. Of course, that would have cut me, you know, but it's like, okay, we all have the right to make those decisions in our life. But, you know, I hadn't earned that kind of, you know, treatment from him. At least I didn't think so. So,
well, what you did do is you created one hell of a book. And again, congratulations. The book, TONECHASER, Understanding Edward, my 26-year journey with Edward Van Halen. I'm going to quote Eddie Van Halen, the late, great Eddie Van Halen. Steve Rosen, congratulations again, and thank you for joining us today. It's we could go on all day, but Walt has to get back to work, and I have things to do, and you your time is valuable. Walt, any parting shots?
No, Steve, just thank you for your time. And this was an amazing conversation. You said so much insight. We'd love to have you again, talk other musicians, other artists. It would be great to have you back on someday. So thank you.
Anytime, guys. Thank you for your time. And I hate to put in a plug, but paypal.me/ToneChaser if you want the book. And it's out there. And guys, thank you so much for your wonderful questions and, having me on. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Steve. And happy birthday, Eddie. We miss you and love you.
Yes, we do.